June 4, 1942. The pre-dawn darkness shrouded the Japanese carrier Akagi as Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood on the bridge, watching the eastern horizon for the first hint of light. In his hands, he clutched a weather report that should not have existed, intelligence that no Japanese officer was meant to possess. The paper contained decrypted American radio transmissions revealing that within 15 minutes, United States carriers would launch 216 aircraft against the Japanese fleet, a strike force that would forever alter the course of the Pacific War. What Fuchida did not know in that moment was that this unauthorized intelligence, born from one radio operator's obsession and necessity, would lead to one of the most extraordinary tactical responses in naval warfare history. This decision would determine whether Japan's carrier fleet survived to fight another day or perished beneath Pacific waves, taking with it any hope of Japanese naval supremacy. The journey to that moment began with a problem that plagued the Japanese carrier fleet in the Pacific, a problem written in the blood of pilots who died from inadequate early warning systems. The standard air search protocols, while methodical, were insufficient against American carrier operations. Japanese search planes flying in predetermined patterns at scheduled intervals provided warning that was often too little and too late. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The reality of carrier warfare had evolved faster than doctrine. By mid-1942, American carrier tactics had become increasingly sophisticated, launching larger strike packages from greater distances than Japanese naval planners had anticipated. While Japanese carriers maintained strict radio silence to conceal their positions, American task forces had developed more advanced communication systems, enabling coordinated strikes that could overwhelm Japanese combat air patrols. In the vast expanses of the Pacific, where horizons stretched endlessly and weather changed with deadly unpredictability, early detection meant survival. A carrier spotted first became a carrier sunk. Each minute of warning translated directly into fighters scrambled, defensive positions assumed, evasive maneuvers executed. The difference between 5 minutes of warning and 15 minutes could mean the difference between salvation and destruction. Japanese carrier doctrine created specific vulnerabilities that existing detection methods simply could not address. American strike aircraft typically approached at wave-top level, making them nearly invisible to search planes flying at higher altitudes. Once spotted, the information had to travel through multiple layers of command before reaching the carriers. This bureaucratic delay cost precious minutes when seconds mattered. The Imperial Japanese Navy's rigid command structure compounded the problem. Information flowed strictly up and down the chain of command, with limited horizontal communication between ships or fleet elements. This meant that a scout plane from one carrier group might detect an incoming strike but fail to alert other carrier groups quickly enough. In the fluid combat of carrier warfare, where strikes might develop from unexpected directions, this rigidity proved increasingly dangerous. Individual officers understood this problem intimately, felt it in their bones every time they watched carrier pilots scramble too late, every time damage control teams fought fires that better warning might have prevented. They understood that their survival depended on detection systems that functioned minutes too slow, delivered with insufficient detail to effectively counter American strike packages. Mitsuo Fuchida understood this problem better than most. Born in Nara Prefecture on December 3, 1902, he had joined the Imperial Japanese Navy with a communications specialist's understanding of radio technology, how signals propagated across vast distances, how coded transmissions might be intercepted and decrypted. His pre-war training had given him hands-on experience with wireless sets, with understanding signal strength and direction finding, with the practical knowledge of how to modify existing equipment to perform new functions.
When Fuchida graduated from the Naval Academy in 1924, he brought with him not just technical expertise, but innovative thinking. The carrier service was an experiment, a revolutionary force designed to project power across oceanic distances. They trained relentlessly, fought fiercer, and thought differently than conventional naval officers. The carrier service attracted officers who sought the cutting edge, who believed that new technologies required new tactics. The training regime was deliberately comprehensive, designed to produce officers who understood every aspect of carrier operations, from navigation to aircraft maintenance, from meteorology to signals intelligence. Those who mastered these disciplines formed the core of Japan's Carrier Officer Corps, characterized by technical proficiency, tactical creativity, and a willingness to challenge conventional approaches. This culture of innovation would prove crucial when Fuchida encountered his first unauthorized American signal intercept during the early carrier battles of 1942. The carrier service was encouraged to innovate, to find solutions where regulations saw only obstacles. Officers operating hundreds of miles from fleet headquarters would face situations that no manual could address, where survival and mission success would depend on the ability to improvise and adapt. In a conventional Japanese naval unit, an officer modifying intelligence protocols without authorization might face court-martial. In the carrier service, that same officer's initiative might be rewarded with quiet approval and support. Petty Officer Yoshikawa Takeo represented everything the standard Japanese naval intelligence system was not. Where official channels moved information methodically upward through proper protocols, Yoshikawa operated with intuitive urgency. This remarkable difference was achieved through fundamental mindset rather than simple procedural modifications. Yoshikawa had created a parallel intelligence system specifically for carrier operations, where every second mattered for survival. The young petty officer had been assigned to the communications section of the carrier Akagi in January 1942. His technical aptitude had been noted during training, marking him for special assignment.
Before the war, Yoshikawa had studied radio technology at the Naval Communications School in Yokosuka, where he had shown an unusual aptitude for signal analysis and decryption. More importantly, he had developed an obsessive interest in American naval communications. While his classmates focused on mastering official protocols, Yoshikawa spent his free time listening to American commercial radio broadcasts, teaching himself English through immersion, developing an ear for American speech patterns and communication styles. This informal education proved invaluable when war came. Yoshikawa could distinguish American accents, recognize individual radio operators by their transmission styles, identify patterns in seemingly random communications that others missed entirely. His talents were unconventional, not easily categorized within formal naval structures, but potentially invaluable in combat. Captain Aoki Taijiro, the Akagi's communications officer, recognized Yoshikawa's unique abilities immediately. He assigned the young petty officer to monitoring American radio frequencies, not expecting immediate intelligence, but hoping to develop capabilities for future operations. What he got instead was a revolution in tactical warning. During the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, Yoshikawa first demonstrated what would become his signature contribution. While monitoring American frequencies, he detected subtle changes in transmission patterns that indicated imminent aircraft launches. The volume of routine communications dropped slightly. Check-in procedures accelerated. Certain phrases appeared with greater frequency. To most listeners, these changes would mean nothing. To Yoshikawa, they painted a clear picture. American carriers were preparing to launch aircraft. He reported his observations to Captain Aoki, who initially dismissed them as speculative. But when American aircraft appeared precisely when Yoshikawa had predicted, Aoki's skepticism transformed into cautious interest. The young petty officer had identified a vulnerability in American communications discipline. While U.S. Navy protocols maintained strict radio silence for the carriers themselves, the aircraft preparing to launch often conducted equipment checks. Squadron leaders confirmed assignments. Air controllers established parameters.
These communications, seemingly innocuous individually, created patterns that Yoshikawa's trained ear could interpret. After Coral Sea, Yoshikawa was given greater latitude to develop his techniques. He requisitioned additional radio equipment, training 2 assistants in his methods, creating work shifts that ensured continuous monitoring of American frequencies. Most critically, he began compiling a catalog of American procedural phrases and patterns, correlating them with subsequent actions. His modifications were crude but functional. He left the standard intelligence channels intact, but created a parallel reporting system that delivered warnings directly to the carrier bridge and combat information center, bypassing multiple layers of analysis and approval. When Yoshikawa detected launch preparations, his reports reached decision-makers within minutes rather than the hour or more required by standard protocols.
When the Japanese carrier fleet sorted toward Midway in early June 1942, Yoshikawa's system had been operational for barely 3 weeks. It remained unofficial, unauthorized, a procedural modification that existed in the gray area between innovation and insubordination. But Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier force, had given his tacit approval. Results mattered more than protocols when survival hung in the balance. The morning of June 4th dawned clear, with moderate seas. The Japanese carrier force had approached Midway undetected, their presence still unknown to the island garrison. Admiral Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway at 0430, sending 108 aircraft to soften the island's defenses before the planned invasion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. At 0545, Petty Officer Yoshikawa detected the first anomalies in American radio traffic. The patterns matched those he had cataloged as pre-launch communications. Brief transmissions, often just 2 or 3 words, acknowledgments without context. To the untrained ear, they were radio noise. To Yoshikawa, they were alarm bells. He immediately sent a messenger to the bridge with his assessment. American carriers were preparing to launch aircraft. The messenger, Seaman Ito Hiroshi, sprinted through the Akagi's passageways, climbing ladders and pushing past officers who shouted at his breach of protocol. Protocol dictated that such reports traveled through proper channels, be verified by superior officers, receive proper authentication. But Yoshikawa had impressed upon Ito the critical nature of time. Each minute lost increased the danger to the carrier. Ito burst onto the bridge at 0550, his appearance causing immediate consternation among the staff officers present. Captain Aoki, seeing his communications sailor arrive in such a state, moved immediately to intercept him. The message was delivered directly to Commander Fuchida, who had been briefed on Yoshikawa's system and understood its implications. Fuchida immediately informed Admiral Nagumo, who faced a critical decision point. The first wave of Japanese aircraft was still attacking Midway. The second wave, initially armed with torpedoes for naval targets, had been ordered rearmed with bombs to continue the assault on Midway's ground installations. The Flint decks were crowded with aircraft and ordnance. Changing course now would throw the entire operation into chaos. But if Yoshikawa was correct, American strike aircraft would be airborne within minutes, searching for the Japanese carriers. Without fighter cover, the Japanese fleet would be devastated. Every carrier commander knew the mathematics of air defense. For every 10 attacking aircraft, at least 1 would get through, even the best defenses. And 1 bomb or torpedo hit in the wrong place could doom a carrier. Nagumo hesitated, weighing traditional intelligence against Yoshikawa's unauthorized system. The official search planes had reported no sightings. Standard doctrine said to continue the planned operation. But Fuchida urged immediate action, arguing that 15 minutes of warning could make the difference between victory and annihilation. At 0554, Nagumo made his decision. He ordered all available fighters launched immediately to establish combat air patrol.
The rearming operation was halted, with ordnance teams ordered to clear the hangar decks as quickly as possible. The fleet would change course, turning into the wind to facilitate fighter launches while presenting a different position than the Americans might expect. Fuchida watched as the first Zero fighters were rushed to the flight decks. The ordnance teams worked with frantic speed, clearing bombs and torpedoes, moving aircraft, creating space for emergency operations. The machinery of carrier operations, normally functioning with choreographed precision, now moved with desperate urgency. At 06, exactly 15 minutes after Yoshikawa's warning, the first American aircraft were detected by radar, approaching from the northeast. They were still far distant, their attack runs at least an hour away, but they were precisely where Yoshikawa had predicted they would be. His unauthorized intelligence system had provided the warning that official channels could not. The 15 minutes gained through Yoshikawa's innovation transformed the tactical situation entirely. Instead of being caught with flight decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, the Japanese carriers were clearing for action. Instead of minimal combat air patrol, fighters were launching to establish defensive positions. Instead of presenting stationary targets on predicted courses, the fleet was changing position, forcing American attackers to adjust their approaches. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu turned into the wind, their huge hulls cutting through the Pacific swells as they built speed for flight operations. Steam catapults launched Zero fighters in rapid succession, the aircraft climbing sharply to establish defensive altitudes. On the flag bridge, Admiral Nagumo watched through binoculars as the combat air patrol formed above the fleet. 15 minutes of warning would not guarantee survival, but it transformed catastrophic surprise into contested battle. Without Yoshikawa's system, the American strike would have arrived over an unprepared fleet, caught in the midst of rearming operations with minimal fighter cover and predictable positions. With those 15 minutes, the Japanese carriers at least had fighting chance. Fuchida returned to the communications center where Yoshikawa continued monitoring American frequencies. The petty officer barely acknowledged the commander's arrival, his attention fixed on his headphones, his hand moving across a notepad as he recorded transmission patterns. His face showed the strain of intense concentration, the knowledge that lives depended on his ability to interpret patterns that others couldn't even detect. The modifications Yoshikawa had made to standard communications intelligence were technically violations of naval regulations.
He had created unauthorized reporting channels, reassigned personnel without formal approval, modified equipment allocations. In peacetime, such actions would merit severe discipline. In war, with carriers at risk, the results spoke for themselves. Fuchida placed a hand on Yoshikawa's shoulder, a gesture of acknowledgement that needed no words. The 15 minutes of warning represented more than time gained. They represented a philosophy of innovation, a willingness to challenge established procedures when survival required adaptation. The battle still hung in the balance, its outcome uncertain. But whatever happened next, those 15 minutes had given the Japanese carriers the opportunity to fight rather than merely die. The American strike force comprised 216 aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters, the largest coordinated carrier airstrike yet attempted in naval warfare. Without Yoshikawa's warning, they would have achieved complete surprise against unprepared targets. With it, they faced an alerted defense, prepared to contest every approach, to fight for the fleet's survival with everything available. As the Japanese combat air patrol climbed to altitude and the carriers maneuvered into defensive positions, Fuchida knew the battle could still go either way. But Yoshikawa's 15 minutes had changed the fundamental equation. The unauthorized intelligence, the procedural violation, the intuitive leap beyond established doctrine, these things had given the Japanese carriers something precious beyond measure in carrier warfare: time. In those 15 minutes lay the difference between helpless slaughter and fighting defense, between certain defeat and possible victory. In the calculus of carrier warfare, where single bomb hits determined the fate of thousand-man crews and aircraft worth more than their weight in silver, 15 minutes might prove the most valuable commodity in the entire Pacific theater.
The knowledge that he had gained those minutes through supporting Yoshikawa's unauthorized system filled Fuchida with fierce pride, regardless of what the next hours might bring. The American aircraft approached the Japanese fleet in 3 distinct groups, each launched from a different carrier. Under normal circumstances, the absence of coordination between these groups would have been a critical weakness. But the 15 minutes of warning had given the Japanese defenders time to prepare a complex response, forcing them to divide their attention across multiple threat axes. Fuchida watched from Akagi's bridge as Zero fighters intercepted the first wave of American torpedo bombers. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, positioned perfectly thanks to the advance warning, tore into the slow, vulnerable American aircraft. Through his binoculars, Fuchida could see the deadly ballet unfolding. American Devastator torpedo bombers, forced to fly straight and level during their attack runs, made perfect targets for the agile Zeros. But while the Zeros focused on the torpedo threat, American dive bombers from USS Enterprise appeared from above, plunging toward the Japanese carriers from 18,000 feet.
This was precisely the scenario that naval theorists had predicted. The defender forced to choose which threat to counter, unable to stop everything simultaneously. Without Yoshikawa's 15 minutes, the Japanese carriers would have been caught with aircraft on deck, fueled and armed, creating massive secondary explosions when hit. Instead, the frantic damage control preparations had cleared much of this volatile material below decks. When the first 1,000-pound bomb struck Akagi's flight deck, it penetrated to the hangar deck before detonating, causing serious damage, but not the catastrophic magazine explosions that might have occurred otherwise. Fuchida was thrown across the bridge by the impact, slamming into the bulkhead with enough force to crack ribs. Through a haze of pain, he saw the damage control teams rushing to the impact point, dragging hoses, carrying extinguishers, moving with the disciplined urgency of men trained for this precise emergency. Captain Aoki appeared through the smoke, his white uniform stained with soot, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "Commander, the communications center took a direct hit. Yoshikawa and his team." He didn't need to finish. The implications were clear. The communications center, located directly beneath the island structure, would have been devastated by the bomb hit. Fuchida struggled to his feet, ignoring the stabbing pain in his side. "The warning system." "Destroyed, sir. We're operating on standard protocols now." Those 15 minutes had given them a fighting chance, but now they were flying blind again, dependent on the same inadequate warning systems that had nearly doomed them at the outset. The battle continued to rage across miles of ocean as Japanese fighters struggled to intercept American aircraft while damage control teams fought to save the stricken carriers. On the Akagi's hangar deck, Chief Petty Officer Takahashi Hirito led his damage control party through choking smoke and spreading flames. The 15-minute warning had allowed him to position emergency equipment strategically, to brief his teams on specific responsibilities, to prepare both mentally and practically for the attack they all knew was coming. Without that preparation, the bomb hit might have already doomed the carrier. With it, they had a chance, slim but real, to save the ship. Takahashi had served 20 years in the Imperial Navy, had helped commission Akagi, knew her systems intimately. If anyone could prevent her from joining the long list of carriers already consigned to the deep, it was him and the men he led. "Water pressure dropping on the starboard main," shouted Seaman Nakamura, the youngest member of Takahashi's team. "Rupture somewhere after frame 60. Takahashi made an instant calculation. The rupture would reduce firefighting capability throughout the starboard quarter. Team 2, redirect to the auxiliary manifold, bypass the rupture. Team 3, foam on the aviation fuel spill near the elevator pit. The 15 minutes had been used not just for tactical preparations, but for mental readiness. His men responded with disciplined precision rather than panic, each understanding his role in the desperate battle to save their ship.
Fire aboard an aircraft carrier represented the ultimate nightmare, with aviation fuel, ammunition, and oxygen systems creating conditions for conflagration that could consume the entire vessel within minutes. Under normal conditions, with no warning, the first bomb hit would likely have triggered a cascading series of secondary explosions as fueled aircraft ignited. The 15 minutes had allowed them to drain fuel lines, move armed aircraft below, establish damage control stations. It wasn't enough to prevent serious damage, but it created a margin between catastrophic loss and potential salvation. Takahashi led his men deeper into the burning hangar deck, the heat intensifying with each step. Their asbestos suits provided minimal protection, more psychological comfort than actual defense against temperatures that approached 1,000 degrees in some areas. Through his face mask, Takahashi could see aircraft burning, aluminum airframes melting into unrecognizable puddles of metal. But the firefighting teams were holding the line, preventing the flames from reaching the torpedo storage area aft. If the fire reached those torpedoes, with their volatile oxygen-based propellant, Akagi would be lost regardless of their efforts. The 15 minutes had given them time to establish fire breaks, to move what ordnance they could, to prepare for precisely this scenario. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag to the light cruiser Nagara as Akagi burned, faced the most difficult decision of his career. The 15 minutes had prevented immediate disaster, had given his carriers a fighting chance, but the American attack had still inflicted serious damage. Akagi and Kaga were burning, their fate uncertain. Soryu had taken multiple hits and was clearly doomed. Only Hiryu remained fully operational. The traditional response would be to withdraw, to preserve what remained of his force. But Nagumo understood that this battle would determine the entire course of the Pacific War. If the Japanese carrier force was destroyed, Japan's offensive capability would die with it. No replacement carriers would be available for at least a year. No trained pilots could replace those lost. The 15 minutes had given him options that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Without Yoshikawa's warning, all 4 carriers would likely be sinking by now, the debate rendered moot by complete destruction. With it, he still had Hiryu intact and the possibility of saving Akagi or Kaga. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't utter defeat either. "Launch all available aircraft from Hiryu," Nagumo ordered, his voice steady despite the catastrophe unfolding around him. "Find the American carriers. They will have few fighters left aboard after committing to this attack." The 15 minutes had created tactical options that extended beyond mere survival. Because the Japanese combat air patrol had been fully launched and positioned optimally, they had shot down a significant percentage of the American attack force. Because damage control teams had been prepared, there was still hope of saving at least one of the damaged carriers. Because the fleet had changed course based on the warning, some American attack groups had been forced to search longer, consuming fuel that limit to their combat effectiveness.
Aboard Hiryu, Lieutenant Commander Kobayashi Heiji prepared to lead the counterattack. As Air Group Commander, he had spent the 15 minutes of warning organizing his strike packages, briefing his pilots, studying the limited intelligence on American carrier positions. Where a hasty, disorganized response might have been the only option without warning, the 15 minutes had allowed for coordinated planning. Kobayashi gathered his pilots for final instructions, the roar of Hiryu's engines providing background to his words as the carrier turned into the wind for launch operations. "The Americans will not expect a coherent counterattack," he told them, raising his voice to be heard over the engines. "They believe they have crippled our force. Their combat air patrols will be depleted after committing aircraft to the strike. Their decks will be crowded with returning aircraft, refueling and rearming." This tactical insight, the vulnerability of carriers during recovery operations, mirrored precisely the danger that Yoshikawa's 15 minutes had helped the Japanese fleet avoid. The Americans, assuming their attack had been devastating, would not expect immediate retaliation. The psychological advantage lay with the force that could defy expectations, could punch back when presumed defeated. The 15 minutes had created not just tactical advantage, but psychological initiative. The Japanese carriers had absorbed a powerful blow, yet remained capable of offensive action, a resilience that would have been impossible without the advance warning. As Kobayashi's strike force launched from Hiryu's deck, it represented the difference between passive destruction and active resistance, between accepting defeat and contesting the battle to its conclusion. Aboard the burning Akagi, Fuchida had joined Takahashi's damage control efforts. His position as air operations officer was temporarily irrelevant with the flight deck devastated by bomb hits.
Instead, he applied his knowledge of the ship's architecture to the desperate fight to save her. The 15 minutes had allowed for preparation that made this fight possible. Without it, Akagi would already be abandoned, her back broken by uncontrolled fires and secondary explosions. The fire doors to the forward magazine held, Takahashi reported, his voice hoarse from smoke and exertion. We've contained the hangar deck fire to sections 3 through 5. If we can keep it from spreading aft, we have a chance. Fuchida nodded, understanding the narrow margin between survival and destruction. Carriers were paradoxes, massive, powerful vessels that were simultaneously extraordinarily vulnerable. Their strength came from the aircraft they carried, their vulnerability from the fuel and ordnance those aircraft required. The 15 minutes had allowed them to minimize that vulnerability at the critical moment, creating the possibility of survival that Takahashi and his men were now fighting to realize. As they battled the fires below decks, Kobayashi's strike force located the American carrier Yorktown. The Japanese pilots, executing the plan developed during those precious 15 minutes of warning, approached from multiple directions to divide the American combat air patrol. The tactic worked precisely as intended, with several Japanese dive bombers breaking through the defensive screen to score direct hits on Yorktown's flight deck. The damage to Yorktown, while not immediately fatal, effectively removed her from the battle. The Japanese counterattack, made possible only by the 15 minutes that had prevented complete destruction of their carrier force, had achieved significant results against an enemy who believed they had already won the engagement. This psychological dimension, the shock of a supposedly defeated enemy striking back effectively, rippled through the American command structure. Caution replaced confidence. Defensive posture replaced aggressive pursuit. The 15 minutes had transformed not just the tactical reality, but the psychological dynamic of the entire battle. By late afternoon, the situation had stabilized into a grim calculus of survival. Akagi and Kaga, thanks to the damage control preparations made possible by the 15 minutes of warning, had been saved from immediate destruction. Both were severely damaged, unable to conduct air operations, but neither had sunk. Soryu had been lost, despite all efforts. Hiryu, after launching her counterattack against Yorktown, had herself been located and attacked by American aircraft, suffering critical damage. The Japanese carrier force had been crippled but not annihilated. Of the 4 fleet carriers that began the day, 2 remained afloat, with potential for eventual repair. Without Yoshikawa's 15 minutes, all 4 would almost certainly have been lost with much higher personnel casualties. The warning had not delivered victory, but it had prevented absolute defeat. As night fell across the battle area, Fuchida stood on Akagi's listing deck, watching damage control teams continue their work by searchlight. The carrier's fate remained uncertain. She might yet sink if progressive flooding couldn't be controlled. But she had survived the day against overwhelming odds. The 15 minutes had made that survival possible, had transformed certain destruction into potential salvation. Yoshikawa's unauthorized intelligence system, his willingness to circumvent procedures in service of a higher purpose, had given the Japanese carriers those crucial 15 minutes. The difference between total loss and partial survival, between 4,000 sailors dead and perhaps 1,500, lay in that brief window of preparation that official channels could not have provided. In the Imperial Navy's formal assessment, conducted weeks later as engineers evaluated the damage to Akagi and Kaga, the role of early warning received particular emphasis. The official report, prepared by Captain Watanabe Yasuji of Naval Intelligence, noted that conventional search patterns proved inadequate against American strike tactics, but that innovative signals monitoring provided critical advance notice that prevented complete disaster. This diplomatic language deliberately obscured the unauthorized nature of Yoshikawa's system. The report recommended expansion and formalization of radio intercept capabilities, without acknowledging that such capabilities had been developed outside official channels by a junior petty officer acting on his own initiative. The tension between innovation and procedure, between individual initiative and institutional doctrine, remained unresolved in the aftermath. The Imperial Navy, traditionally bound by rigid hierarchy and formalized procedures,
struggled to incorporate the lessons of those 15 minutes without admitting the failure of official systems. Yoshikawa himself had not survived to see the impact of his innovation. The bomb that struck Akagi's island structure had killed him instantly, along with most of the communications staff. His unauthorized intelligence system died with him, the equipment destroyed, the techniques unrecorded in any formal documentation. Fuchida, recovering from his injuries at the naval hospital in Truk, became the primary advocate for institutionalizing what Yoshikawa had created. He understood better than anyone the value of those 15 minutes, the lives saved and capabilities preserved through one petty officer's willingness to work outside established procedures. Yoshikawa showed us that doctrine must serve survival, not the reverse, Fuchida wrote in his report to Admiral Yamamoto. In the critical moments before American aircraft appeared, his unauthorized system provided warning that official channels could not. The result was partial survival rather than complete destruction. Yamamoto, perhaps the most forward-thinking of Japan's senior officers, recognized the fundamental truth in Fuchida's assessment. Innovation in warfare came not from committees or formal processes, but from individuals willing to challenge established procedures when circumstances demanded it. But institutionalizing such innovation proved challenging. The same hierarchical structure that maintained discipline and coordination also stifled the kind of individual initiative that Yoshikawa had demonstrated. Junior officers hesitated to suggest modifications to established procedures, fearing career repercussions. Senior officers resisted changes that implied criticism of existing doctrine. The 15 minutes had exposed this institutional contradiction. The warning that saved thousands of lives and preserved critical naval assets had come from outside the approved channels, from a system that violated procedural norms in service of tactical necessity. In August 1942, as Akagi underwent repairs at Kure Naval Arsenal, Fuchida convened an unofficial working group of communications officers from across the fleet. Their mission, tacitly approved by Yamamoto but never formally authorized, was to develop an early warning system based on Yoshikawa's techniques.
"We face an enemy who speaks freely on open frequencies," Fuchida told the assembled officers. "Their operational security is different from ours, creating a vulnerability if we know how to exploit it. Yoshikawa showed us that 15 minutes of warning can mean the difference between destruction and survival." The officers, many of whom had served with Yoshikawa or witnessed the impact of his warning at Midway, understood the stakes. Traditional Japanese emphasis on radio silence had created a blind spot in their thinking, a failure to recognize that the enemy's different communication culture offered intelligence opportunities. Working from Yoshikawa's fragmentary notes, recovered from his personal effects after the battle, they began reconstructing his techniques. The task was challenging. Yoshikawa had been self-taught, his methods intuitive rather than systematic. He had recognized patterns that others missed, correlations between specific transmission characteristics and subsequent actions. Lieutenant Takeda Shigeo, who had trained with Yoshikawa at the communications school in Yokosuka, provided critical insights. "He was obsessed with American radio culture," Takeda explained. "He listened to commercial broadcasts, entertainment programs, even baseball games. He said understanding how Americans talked casually helped him recognize when their military communications indicated serious intent. This cultural dimension of signals intelligence had been entirely absent from official Japanese doctrine. Conventional analysis focused on message content, encryption methods, transmission frequencies. Yoshikawa's innovation had been to focus instead on transmission patterns, the subtle changes in communication tempo and style that preceded major operations. The working group's unofficial nature allowed for creative approaches that formal channels would have rejected. They recruited English-speaking officers, including those who had studied in America before the war. They obtained recordings of American commercial radio to study speech patterns and colloquialisms. They developed a catalog of transmission characteristics associated with specific naval operations. By October 1942, as the naval situation in the Solomon Islands deteriorated for Japan, the group had developed what they called the Yoshikawa system, a formalized version of the techniques that had provided those crucial 15 minutes at Midway.
Unlike the original, which relied heavily on individual intuition, the new system included structured analysis methods and specific indicators that even less experienced operators could recognize. The system faced its first test during the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942. A Japanese task force approaching to bombard Henderson Field received 30 minutes advance warning of an American airstrike through the Yoshikawa system. The warning allowed for full combat air patrol deployment and evasive maneuvers that significantly reduced losses. Admiral Kondo Nobutake, commanding the task force, reported afterward that early detection through radio intercept prevented severe damage to major surface units. The diplomatic language, again, obscured the unauthorized origins of the system that provided this early detection, but the results spoke for themselves.
Fuchida, who survived the war to become one of Japan's leading analysts of the conflict, would later reflect that Yoshikawa's 15 minutes at Midway represented the fundamental dilemma of military organizations. The procedures that maintain order and coordination can become obstacles to the very survival they are meant to ensure. This insight, that doctrine must serve survival rather than constrain it, became Yoshikawa's enduring legacy. The petty officer himself was never formally honored, his innovation never officially acknowledged in Imperial Navy records, but the officers who understood what those 15 minutes had meant, who had seen the difference between total destruction and fighting survival, carried the lesson forward. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt its defensive forces under American guidance, the principle that Yoshikawa had demonstrated at such personal cost became quietly integrated into training doctrine. Innovation was no longer treated as procedural violation, but as essential capability, with junior officers encouraged to identify improvements to established methods. The 15 minutes that changed the course of the Midway battle, that prevented absolute defeat and preserved critical naval assets for future operations, represented more than just tactical warning. They embodied the principle that survival sometimes requires working outside established channels, that initiative at the individual level can compensate for institutional limitations. For the officers who lived because of those 15 minutes, who watched desperate damage control teams save carriers that should have been lost, who witnessed the psychological impact of counterpunching when the Americans expected only collapse, Yoshikawa's unauthorized innovation represented the difference between helpless destruction and fighting chance. That legacy, the understanding that doctrine exists to preserve fighting capability rather than constrain it, would influence Japanese military thinking long after the details of Yoshikawa's specific techniques had been forgotten. The 15 minutes he provided at Midway, purchased with his own life, offered a lesson more valuable than any tactical advantage: that human initiative, properly applied at the critical moment, could change the course of battle, even against overwhelming odds. The legacy of Yoshikawa's 15 minutes extended far beyond the tactical outcome of a single battle. By 1943, as the war situation deteriorated for Japan, the informal network of officers who understood the significance of his innovation had spread throughout the fleet. They carried with them not just specific techniques for signals intelligence, but a deeper, philosophical approach to warfare, one that valued initiative over procedure when survival hung in the balance. Commander Tanaka Raizo, commanding Destroyer Squadron 2 in the Solomon Islands campaign, embodied this philosophy during the desperate Tokyo Express supply missions to Guadalcanal. Operating under extreme pressure with dwindling fuel reserves and against overwhelming American air superiority, Tanaka implemented his own version of the Yoshikawa principle. Standard doctrine would have us withdraw at the first sign of American aircraft, Tanaka told his officers during a briefing aboard his flagship Jinzu. But Yoshikawa showed us at Midway that preparation transforms vulnerability into opportunity. 15 minutes of warning allowed carriers to survive what should have been fatal blows. We will apply that same principle to our supply missions. Tanaka reorganized his destroyer operations based on enhanced early warning. He stationed picket submarines along likely approach routes for American aircraft, with orders to report sightings immediately via short-burst radio transmissions. He modified his destroyer's damage control procedures, emphasizing rapid response to the specific threats posed by American air attacks. Most significantly, he adjusted his mission planning to incorporate deliberate deception,
creating false targets and diversionary movements specifically designed to waste those precious minutes of American attack time. These modifications to standard doctrine were technically unauthorized. Naval headquarters had issued specific tactical directives for the Tokyo Express operations, detailing formation patterns, approach routes, and engagement protocols. Tanaka's adaptations contradicted several of these directives, technically placing him in violation of orders. But the officers who had witnessed Midway understood the principle at stake. When survival required adaptation, doctrine became secondary to initiative. Tanaka's innovations reduced destroyer losses by approximately 30% compared to squadrons operating under standard protocols. The supplies delivered, ammunition, medicine, food for the desperate garrison on Guadalcanal, sustained Japanese resistance for crucial additional weeks. Vice Admiral Mikawa Gunichi, commanding the 8th Fleet from Rabaul, formally commended Tanaka's performance while carefully avoiding specific mention of his procedural violations. The commendation praised his tactical adaptability and innovative approach to mission parameters, diplomatic language that acknowledged the success of his methods without directly addressing their unauthorized nature. This pattern repeated across the Pacific Theater as Japanese forces struggled against mounting American pressure. Officers who understood the lesson of Yoshikawa's 15 minutes found ways to adapt doctrine to circumstance, to innovate within the confines of rigid command structures, to prioritize survival and effectiveness over procedural compliance. By early 1944, as American forces advanced through the Marshall Islands toward the Marianas, this informal network of innovation had developed into what some officers called the Midway mentality, a shared understanding that initiative at critical moments outweighed procedural constraints. The term was never used in official communications or reports, existing only in private conversations between officers who recognized each other's willingness to adapt when necessary. Lieutenant Commander Ozawa Jisaburo, serving as air operations officer aboard the carrier Zukaku, became one of the most effective practitioners of this philosophy. Having studied the Midway battle extensively, including confidential reports from surviving officers, Ozawa understood the full significance of Yoshikawa's innovation. "The 15 minutes changed everything," he wrote in a personal letter to a classmate from the Naval Academy. "Not just the tactical outcome, but our understanding of what makes an effective officer."
Yoshikawa was a petty officer who saved admirals because he saw what was needed and acted without waiting for permission. That lesson matters more than any tactical doctrine we've been taught. Ozawa applied this understanding during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, when Japanese carriers faced overwhelming American air power. Standard doctrine called for launching all available aircraft to counter American strikes, leaving nothing in reserve. Ozawa modified this approach, holding back a small reserve of fighters specifically to protect the carriers during the most vulnerable recovery operations. This deviation from doctrine, while modest in scale, proved crucial when American dive bombers broke through the main Japanese combat air patrol. The reserve fighters, positioned precisely where Ozawa's analysis suggested they would be most needed, destroyed several attackers that would otherwise have struck the carrier Zuikaku. The difference between survival and destruction came down to this unauthorized modification of standard tactics. Admiral Toyota, reviewing the battle afterward, noted that certain tactical innovations at the small unit level showed promise despite overall strategic failure. Again, the diplomatic language obscured the unauthorized nature of these innovations, protecting the officers who had implemented them while acknowledging their effectiveness. The network of officers who understood and applied the lesson of Yoshikawa's 15 minutes never constituted a formal organization. They held no meetings, issued no memoranda, created no official doctrine. They were connected instead by shared experience and understanding.
by the recognition that survival in the face of overwhelming odds sometimes required working outside established channels. This informal network included officers from across the fleet, destroyer captains like Tanaka, carrier air officers like Ozawa, submarine commanders, even staff officers at fleet headquarters. What united them was not rank or specialty, but philosophical approach, the willingness to innovate when circumstances demanded it, to place mission success and survival above procedural compliance. By late 1944, as American forces approached the Japanese home islands, this network faced its greatest challenge. The strategic situation had become desperate, with Japan's industrial capacity unable to replace losses, fuel reserves dwindling, trained personnel increasingly scarce. In this environment, innovation became not just advantageous, but essential for survival. The defense of the Philippines in October 1944 illustrated both the potential and the limitations of the approach Yoshikawa had inspired. Vice Admiral Kurita Takeo, commanding the Center Force during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, initially followed the Midway mentality when planning his approach through the San Bernardino Strait. He modified standard formation doctrine to maximize survivability against air attack, incorporated deception measures beyond those called for in the operation plan, and adjusted damage control procedures based on lessons from earlier engagements. These innovations helped his force survive American submarine and air attacks during the approach, preserving combat capability that standard doctrine would have sacrificed.
When American carrier aircraft struck his flagship Yamato on October 24, the modified damage control procedures, directly inspired by those implemented after Yoshikawa's 15 minutes at Midway, allowed the massive battleship to survive hits that might otherwise have been fatal. But the limitations became apparent when Kurita encountered the American escort carriers off Samar on October 25. Despite commanding overwhelmingly superior firepower, he hesitated at the critical moment, reverting to standard doctrine rather than seizing the initiative that circumstances offered. The 15 minutes of decision time he had gained through earlier innovations were squandered in procedural deliberation. Kurita's force withdrew without destroying the vulnerable American carriers, missing perhaps the last opportunity to inflict a significant tactical defeat on the U.S. Navy. The innovative approach that had sustained his force through the approach failed at the moment of engagement, revealing the difficulty of maintaining the Midway mentality when institutional pressure reasserted itself. This pattern, innovation in planning and preparation, reversion to doctrine at decisive moments, characterized many late-war Japanese operations. The officers who understood the lesson of Yoshikawa's 15 minutes could implement modifications within their immediate sphere of authority, but struggled to maintain that innovative approach when coordinating with the broader command structure. Captain Kono Takashi, who had served as damage control officer aboard Akagi at Midway and witnessed firsthand the difference those 15 minutes made, articulated this challenge in a confidential assessment prepared for Naval Headquarters in early 1945. The lesson of Yoshikawa's 15 minutes remains incompletely learned, he wrote. We recognize the value of initiative in crisis, the necessity of adaptation when survival is at stake, but our institutional structure continues to privilege procedure over effectiveness, uniformity over innovation. The result is tactical adaptability without strategic flexibility, individual initiative constrained by collective rigidity. Kono's assessment, filed away in naval archives rather than circulated among operational commanders, represented a clear-eyed evaluation of the tension between innovation and institution. The network of officers influenced by the Midway mentality had achieved tactical improvements that preserved forces and extended Japan's defensive capability. But they had not transformed the institutional culture that ultimately determined strategic outcomes. As American forces approached Okinawa in early 1945, the last major carrier operation of the war illustrated this tension in stark terms. The battleship Yamato, accompanied by a small escort force, was ordered to attack the American invasion fleet in a one-way suicide mission designated Operation 10 Go.
The plan, developed by staff officers with limited combat experience, represented standard doctrine applied without regard for tactical reality, precisely the opposite of the approach Yoshikawa had exemplified. Captain Ariga Kosaku, Yamato's commanding officer, received the orders with the stoic acceptance expected of a Japanese naval officer. But privately, among his senior officers who shared the Midway mentality, he expressed frustration at the strategic bankruptcy of the mission. "We face the same situation as at Midway," he told his executive officer the night before sailing.
But instead of seeking 15 minutes of advantage through innovation, we are sacrificing our last capital ship in a gesture of defiance without tactical purpose. Akagi modified what he could within his authority. He adjusted damage control procedures based on lessons learned throughout the war, positioned his limited air defense resources for maximum effectiveness, and developed a tactical approach that offered at least some chance of inflicting damage before the inevitable destruction of his ship. These modifications represented the last application of the principle Yoshikawa had demonstrated at Midway, adapting doctrine to circumstance when survival hung in the balance. But the strategic framework of the mission, dictated by headquarters staff far removed from operational reality, remained unchanged. On April 7, 1945, Yamato was attacked by American carrier aircraft and sunk with the loss of most of her crew, including Captain Akagi. The tactical modifications he had implemented allowed the battleship to absorb extraordinary punishment before finally capsizing, but could not change the fundamental outcome dictated by strategic decisions beyond his control. The destruction of Yamato represented the culmination of the tension between innovation and institution that had characterized Japanese naval operations since Midway. The lessons of Yoshikawa's 15 minutes, the value of initiative, the necessity of adaptation, the primacy of effectiveness over procedure had spread among operational officers but failed to penetrate the strategic decision-making apparatus. In the final months of the war, as Japan faced imminent invasion, the officers who had absorbed these lessons found themselves in increasingly desperate circumstances. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft, ammunition shortages constrained training, and industrial collapse prevented the replacement of lost equipment. In this environment, innovation could mitigate but not reverse the strategic disadvantage. Commander Nakamura Toshio, who had served as Fuchida's communications officer at Midway and witnessed the implementation of Yoshikawa's system, commanded a coastal defense battery near Yokosuka in the summer of 1945. With limited ammunition for training and obsolete equipment, he faced the prospect of defending against American naval forces with virtually no chance of success. Drawing on the lesson of Yoshikawa's 15 minutes, Nakamura reorganized his battery's operation entirely. Instead of following standard doctrine for coastal artillery, which emphasized volume of fire against ship targets, he developed a modified approach focused on mobility and deception. His gun crews practiced rapid displacement between prepared positions, creating the impression of multiple batteries where only one existed. He established an observation network using civilian volunteers, providing early warning that official channels could not deliver. Most significantly, he adjusted firing procedures to emphasize accuracy over rate of fire, recognizing that with limited ammunition, each shell must count. These innovations, like Yoshikawa's system at Midway, existed outside official doctrine. Coastal defense manuals specified fixed firing positions, standard communication protocols, and established rate-of-fire parameters. Nakamura's modifications contradicted these specifications in service of tactical effectiveness under actual conditions rather than theoretical parameters. The effectiveness of these innovations was never tested in combat.
By the 1970s, as Japan emerged as an economic superpower, management theorists in both countries began formally studying the organizational principles that enabled this success. They identified characteristics, continuous improvement processes, quality circles, flexible manufacturing systems, that institutionalized the balance between structure and initiative. What none of these theorists recognized was the connection between these management innovations and a desperate battle 3 decades earlier, when 15 minutes of unauthorized warning had meant the difference between total destruction and fighting survival. The link existed not in formal documentation or acknowledged influence, but in the lived experience of officers who carried the lesson of Midway into civilian endeavors.
The broader significance of Yoshikawa's 15 minutes extended beyond specific techniques or outcomes to a fundamental understanding of how organizations function under pressure. The institutions that survive existential challenges are rarely those that follow procedures most rigidly, but rather those that adapt most effectively, that encourage initiative when circumstances demand it, that value outcomes over methods. This understanding represented Yoshikawa's enduring legacy, more significant than the specific intelligence system he created or the tactical advantage it provided. He demonstrated that individual initiative, properly applied at critical moments, could alter outcomes that doctrine declared inevitable. He showed that the purpose of hierarchy was to coordinate action, not constrain innovation. In the decades following the war, as both Japan and the United States reflected on the lessons of their conflict, this principle emerged in different forms in military doctrine, management theory, and organizational design. The specific connection to Yoshikawa's 15 minutes at Midway remained largely unrecognized, the thread of influence visible only to those who had experienced its impact directly. The United States Navy, analyzing Japanese operations after the war, noted the effectiveness of certain tactical innovations without identifying their unauthorized origins. American officers studying the Midway battle focused on the strategic victory rather than the specific factors that allowed partial Japanese survival. The institutional dynamics that both constrained and enabled innovation remained largely unexplored in formal analyses. But among the officers who lived because of those 15 minutes, who witnessed the difference between total destruction and fighting chance, who understood how unauthorized initiative had saved ships and lives, the lesson remained visceral rather than academic. They carried it forward not as formal doctrine, but as lived philosophy, applied in contexts far removed from the desperate carrier battle where they learned it. The tension between innovation and institution, between initiative and procedure, between adaptation and doctrine remains unresolved in modern organizations. Military forces still struggle to balance hierarchical control with tactical flexibility. Corporations still seek the optimal point between structured coordination and creative adaptation. Government agencies still navigate the space between regulatory consistency and situational responsiveness.
They carried that understanding forward into post-war Japan, applying it in contexts ranging from corporate strategy to educational reform, from technological innovation to social organization. The economic miracle that transformed Japan represented, in part, the institutionalization of what Yoshikawa had demonstrated through individual initiative, that adaptation under pressure creates possibilities that rigid adherence to established methods cannot achieve. For a nation rebuilding from total defeat, this principle offered a pathway to renewal. The same innovative approach that had provided 15 minutes of warning at Midway could be applied to industrial development, to market competition, to technological advancement. The lesson that saved carriers from destruction could help build new industries from the ashes of war. The ultimate significance of Yoshikawa's 15 minutes lies not in the specific battle where they made their difference, but in the philosophical approach they exemplified. Organizations succeed not by following procedures most rigidly, but by adapting most effectively, by encouraging initiative that serves purpose rather than constraining innovation that challenges method. This understanding represents Yoshikawa's enduring legacy, more profound than the tactical warning he provided or the specific ships his innovation helped preserve. He demonstrated through action what management theorists would later articulate through analysis, that in rapidly changing environments, survival depends on balancing structure with flexibility, coordination with initiative, doctrine with adaptation. The 15 minutes that changed the course of a pivotal battle continue to offer their lesson across decades and contexts, a reminder that at critical moments, effectiveness matters more than procedure, initiative more than compliance, adaptation more than doctrine. Organizations that understand this principle, whether military forces or business enterprises, educational institutions or government agencies, possess resilience that extends beyond specific challenges to foundational survival capability. In that sense, Yoshikawa's unauthorized innovation at Midway represents more than a tactical footnote in military history. It offers insight into how human organizations function under existential pressure,
how they survive challenges that established methods cannot address, how they adapt when survival requires innovation beyond approved channels. The 15 minutes he provided, purchased with his own life and preserved through the initiative of officers who understood their significance, continue to illuminate the fundamental tension between structure and adaptation that all organizations must navigate. In moments of greatest pressure, when established methods prove inadequate, the capacity for unauthorized initiative often marks the boundary between destruction and survival. This remains Yoshikawa's most important legacy, more significant than the specific battle where he demonstrated it, more enduring than the tactical advantage he provided, that human initiative, properly applied at critical moments, can change outcomes that doctrine declares inevitable.